Over the 10 years I have spent navigating the darkest corners of the internet, I have learned that true horror rarely looks like a movie. We expect monsters to hide in damp basements or shadowed alleyways. We expect them to look like outcasts. But what happens when the monster is a respected official wearing a government uniform? What happens when the crime scene is not a dungeon, but a mundane office toilet used by dozens of people every single day? Today's case, known as the Vietnamese butcher, is perhaps the most psychologically confusing mystery I have ever covered. It is a story that defies every survival instinct we possess. It involves a victim who spent years begging for his own end, a killer who turned a public holiday into a private nightmare, and a digital manhunt that exposed a double life so terrifying it shook a nation to its core. This is not just a story about a crime. It is a story about the thin, fragile line between a civilized bureaucrat and a primal predator. We are about to walk through a timeline that proves the internet never forgets, and that even the most powerful figures cannot hide from the truth. But before we descend into this abyss, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us shine a light on these shadowed stories. If you are ready to see what lies behind the mask of authority, let's dive in. If you spend enough time navigating the vast, digital ocean of the internet, you eventually learn a terrifying truth. The surface is merely a deception. Most of us stay in the shallow waters, scrolling through social media, watching entertainment, and reading the news. But beneath that illuminated surface lies a deep, pressurized trench, a place where the laws of morality seem to bend and break. Over the 10 years I have been covering internet mysteries, I have stared into that abyss more times than I care to count. I have seen the strange, the unexplained, and the tragic. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the darkness I encountered in July of the year 2025. It was during that sweltering summer month that a series of video clips began to circulate on the fringes of the web, specifically on a notorious shock site known for hosting the world's grimmest footage. The collection was given a title that sent shivers down the spines of those who whispered it: the Vietnamese butcher. Usually, internet horror stories are grainy, chaotic, and confusing. They are often captured on shaky cell phones or distorted security cameras. But the footage that surfaced in July was different. It possessed a terrifying clarity. It was calculated. It was precise. And worst of all, it was professional. The most widely shared clip from this dark collection, titled simply "The Execution," presents a scene that is as mundane as it is nightmarish. The camera frame reveals a top-down view of a small, tiled room, likely a bathroom or a kitchen utility area. The lighting is artificial but bright, casting stark shadows against the walls. On the floor, a tarp has been spread out with meticulous care, covering the blue and white tiles. Lying on this tarp is a man. We do not know his name yet, but we see his vulnerability. He lies on the floor, and beneath his neck rests a thick wooden chopping block, the kind you might find in any household kitchen. The audio paints a contrasting picture of the world outside. Through the walls, you can hear the muffled, distant sounds of barking dogs and passing motorbikes. It is the sound of a normal afternoon in a civilized neighborhood. But inside that room, civilization had long since departed. As the footage rolls, a second figure enters the frame. This individual is the architect of the nightmare. He stands just off-screen for a moment before stepping into view, holding a heavy cleaver. What happens next is not a struggle. It is not a fight. It is a transaction. With a speed and brutality that suggests this was not his first time handling such a tool, the standing figure delivers a sequence of fatal strikes. The camera does not look away. It captures the finality of the act in high definition. But what chilled viewers to the bone was not just the violence. It was the aftermath. The perpetrator did not panic. He did not flee. Instead, The footage shows him immediately setting to work with a level of clinical detachment that is difficult to comprehend. He treats the scene and the victim with a chilling, detached coldness. The screen cuts to black just before the most cruel acts take place. The internet reacted with a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity. Veterans of shock sites, who claimed to be desensitized to everything, admitted that this video felt different. It was the atmosphere of the room. It was the fact that the camera angles shifted, revealing that multiple recording devices had been set up to capture the money shot from different perspectives. This was not a crime of passion. It was a production. Then, a second clip surfaced, titled The Rehearsal. If the first video was horrifying, this one was psychologically devastating. The rehearsal shows the victim while he was still alive. He is seen in an office setting, surrounded by filing cabinets and plastic plants. He kneels, placing his neck on a block, practicing for his own end. Standing over him is the executioner, dressed in branded sportswear and wearing a plastic mask, the kind associated with anonymous hackers. The masked man gently brings the cleaver down to the victim's neck, not to strike, but to measure. He is illustrating the angle. He is correcting the posture. Towards the end of this clip, the kneeling man, the soon-to-be victim, speaks. He asks for the cameras to be turned off. The masked killer, in a gesture that seems almost compassionate, comforts him. They stand up together. The video ends. The implication was undeniable, and it terrified everyone who watched it. The victim was not being held against his will. He was not screaming for help. The victim appeared to be heavily manipulated, falling into a state where he no longer wished to resist. He had walked into that room, laid his head on the block, and allowed the darkness to take him. This realization transformed the case from a simple murder mystery into something far more complex and disturbing. It suggested that out there, in the real world, a pact had been made between a man who wanted to die and a monster who was all too eager to oblige. To understand the horror of the final act, we must first understand the tragedy of the lead actor. The man on the blue and white tiles was not just a nameless body. He was a human being with a history, a family, and a mind that had slowly turned against itself. Following the release of the footage, an underground community of internet sleuths known as Open Source Intelligence, or OSINT, began the arduous task of identifying the victim. It did not take them long to find a name. The man in the video was identified as Nguyen Xuan Dat, a 36-year-old man from a quiet village in the Tay Binh province of Vietnam. In the physical world, Dat was a phantom. He lived an incredibly private life, drifting through the days like a shadow. He had few friends and rarely spoke to his neighbors. To the people in his village, he was simply a quiet man who had left home after the passing of his father. His mother, his only known living relative, struggled with her own health issues and had lost contact with him long ago. When the videos surfaced, there was no one to file a missing person report. There was no one to cry out for him. He had effectively vanished long before his heart stopped beating. However, while Dat was a ghost in the real world, he was vibrantly, disturbingly alive in the digital one. Investigators discovered that for years, Dat had been living a double life. He spent his nights navigating the encrypted corridors of the internet, specifically on a file-sharing platform known as Motherless, a site accessible only via virtual private networks and known for catering to the most deviant of human tastes. On this site, and various other extreme forums, Dat operated under the handle that grimly foreshadowed his fate: Dat beheading. His digital footprint was a manifesto of self-loathing. In leaked messages recovered by investigators, Dat painted a heartbreaking portrait of his own psyche. He wrote with a profound sense of hopelessness, describing himself as ugly and full of disease. He lamented his inability to live a normal life, stating, "I truly am a prisoner of my very own fate." Convinced that he was broken beyond repair, Dat did not seek therapy or connection. Instead, he sought an exit. But he did not want a quiet end. His mental illness had twisted his desire for release into a specific, dark fantasy. He did not just want to die. He wanted to be consumed. For years, Dat meticulously planned his own destruction. He posted on forums, openly discussing his final fantasy. He shared his darkest thoughts and expressed a desire for a tragic end to his life. To the average person, this sounds like the plot of a horror movie, but in the dark corners of the web where Dat spent his time, he found an audience. He found people who did not tell him to seek help, but instead engaged with his delusions. He became obsessed with the aesthetics of his own death. On a forum dedicated to Japanese comics, he requested a translation of a gruesome story titled Applicant for Death. The narrative involved a man who meets a fatal end while in bed with two women, his consciousness seemingly continuing to describe the sensation for a few seconds. For Dat, this was not fiction. It was a blueprint. It was the script he wanted to follow. But finding a co-star for this tragedy proved difficult. For a long time, Dat's calls into the void went unanswered. He rigorously tried to find a female executioner to fulfill his specific fantasy, but he was unsuccessful. Most people, even those in the darkest forums, draw a line at taking a human life. Dat grew frustrated. He amassed a virtual circle of friends who shared similar morbid interests, a death cult of sorts. But they were mostly talk. He was a man holding a ticket to a show that no one wanted to direct. He was ready to leave the world. But he needed someone to open the door. And then, he met a user who did not turn away. He met a user who did not just listen to the fantasy, but offered to make it a reality. He met the man who would eventually put on the green mask and pick up the cleaver. Dat thought he had found a savior who would grant him his final wish. He did not realize he had found a predator who was simply waiting for prey. When the videos first surfaced, the immediate reaction from the general public was one of confusion. The average person cannot conceive of a scenario in which a victim would willingly participate in their own demise. It defies every biological instinct we possess. The instinct to survive, to fight, to flee from danger. However, for those who study the darker history of crime, the dynamic between the Vietnamese butcher and his victim was rare, but not unprecedented. To understand where the investigators looked first, we have to understand the history of the Dark Pact. Up until that point in time, there had only been two prominent cases in modern history where one human being allowed themselves to be consumed by another. Both of these tragic anomalies occurred in Germany. The most infamous was the case of Armin Meyers, a man who posted an advertisement online looking for a young, well-built man who wanted to be eaten. Against all odds, a willing volunteer named Bernd Brandes answered the call. They met, they made an agreement, and the tragedy played out with the victim's full consent. This historical context is crucial because it provided the roadmap for the Vietnamese investigation. The detectives, both official and amateur, knew that this level of specific, ritualistic violence does not happen in a vacuum. It requires a marketplace. Just as Mayways found Brandes on a forum dedicated to cannibalism, investigators reasoned that the Vietnamese victim and his killer had met in a similar digital underground. The legal and moral complexities here are staggering. In no country in the world is it lawful to end a life simply because the victim requests it. Society draws a hard, immovable line in the sand. Euthanasia is a strictly regulated medical procedure, surrounded by legal safeguards and performed by doctors, not by strangers, in tiled rooms with meat cleavers. Whatever agreement Dat had made with his killer, in the eyes of the law, it was still a cold-blooded homicide. The consent of the victim did not absolve the executioner of his crime. It merely made the crime more disturbing. For Dat, however, these legalities were irrelevant. He had drifted far beyond the reach of societal norms. After years of searching, his posts on the motherless file-sharing platform and various other niche forums began to shift in tone. He was no longer just fantasizing. He was negotiating. He had found a community of individuals who did not view his desire as a cry for help, but as a hobby. In this hidden ecosystem, Dat was not an outcast. He was a celebrated figure, a man willing to go all the way. He engaged with a group of like-minded individuals who displayed similar abnormal psychological tendencies. They traded stories, shared art, and discussed the logistics of the unthinkable. But for a long time, it remained just talk. Dat needed a practitioner, not just a spectator. The transition from fantasy to reality likely occurred when Dat crossed paths with the man known as Chung. Unlike the others who offered only words, Chung offered action. He was not repulsed by Dat's request. He was intrigued by it. The two men began a correspondence that would seal Dat's fate. They discussed logistics. They discussed tools. They discussed the menu. It was a negotiation of death, conducted with the casual tone of a business arrangement. The tragedy was set in motion, not by a sudden burst of anger, but by a slow, methodical agreement between a man who wanted to vanish and a man who wanted to destroy. While the authorities remained silent in the months following the video's release, a different kind of force began to mobilize. They called themselves the OSINT and Cyber Investigation Vietnam Community. This was not a formal police unit, nor was it a private detective agency. It was a loose collective of internet users, students, office workers, tech enthusiasts, and concerned citizens who operated in the shadows, using burner accounts and avatars to protect their real identities. Their motivation was a potent mix of curiosity and a desire for justice. The videos had disturbed them deeply, not just because of the violence, but because of the brazen nature of the act. The killer had shown his face, albeit masked, and had allowed the footage to be sold. It felt like a taunt. The community realized that if the police were not going to prioritize this digital mystery, then they would have to solve it themselves. The investigation began with the digital breadcrumbs Dat had left behind. Since the victim's face was clearly visible in the footage, the sleuths knew that someone, somewhere, must know him. But since no family had stepped forward, they had to work backward from his online persona. They started by trawling through Vietnamese online groups dedicated to a forbidden appetite subculture, the slang term used by those with deviant dietary fixations. It was a sickening task, requiring them to read through thousands of depraved messages, but their persistence paid off. They found a user who matched the victim's description. The breakthrough came when they tracked down an account on a forum for gay men that was believed to belong to Dat. In a moment of carelessness, or perhaps a subconscious desire to be found, Dat had posted his mobile phone number in a thread years prior. For an OSINT investigator, a phone number is the master key. Using this number, the sleuths were able to trace it back to a Zalo account, a popular Vietnamese messaging app. The Zalo profile was a goldmine. It listed a specific date of birth, March 10th, 1989. It also provided a name. Armed with a name and a birth date, the investigation moved from the digital world to the physical one. The netizens began cross-referencing these details with public records. They managed to locate a man with Dat's exact name and date of birth listed in a village registry in the Tay Binh province. But was it the same man? To be certain, two courageous members of the group decided to make a phone call. They contacted the village head directly. The conversation confirmed their fears. The village official verified that a man by that name had lived there, but had left the village some time ago after his father passed away. He confirmed that the man had no wife or children, and that his mother had lost contact with him. The pieces of the puzzle snapped into place with a heartbreaking click. The anonymous victim in the horror movie was Nguyen Xuan Dat, a lonely son who had slipped through the cracks of society. Meanwhile, other investigators were busy contacting the few friends listed on Dat's inactive Facebook profile. They sent polite, cautious messages, hoping for a lead. One contact, using the alias Phi Lee, responded, Phi Lee admitted to being part of the same strange online circle. He claimed to have met Dat once in real life, describing him as a fishmonger who worked at a market in Hanoi. But Phi Lei offered something even more valuable than Dat's backstory. He dropped a bombshell. He claimed to know the killer. He told the investigators that both he and Dat had interacted with the executioner on various forums. He said the man went by the name Chung. According to this witness, Dat had been in contact with Chung for a long time. There had been friction between them. Dat had grown frustrated because Chung kept delaying the date. He would promise to perform the deed and then back out. But eventually, Chung had committed to a specific time and place. The OSINT group now had a victim, a motive, and the alias of a suspect. They had done the work that the authorities had not yet started. But they also realized that unmasking Chung would be far more dangerous than identifying Dat. They were no longer just looking for a lost soul. They were hunting a predator who was still out there, watching, and perhaps waiting for his next volunteer. To catch a ghost, you must first understand when they ceased to be human and started becoming a memory. For the investigators of the OSINT community, building a timeline was not just about organizing dates. It was about pinpointing the exact moment the light went out in Nguyen Xuyen Dat's life. By combing through the digital debris left behind on social media and forums, they constructed a chronology that was as coherent as it was chilling. The story converges on a single, fateful date, the 25th of January in the year 2025. This date carries significant weight in Vietnam. It was the period leading up to the Lunar New Year, known as Tet. It is a time of reunion, of returning to one's ancestors, and of celebrating the coming spring. The streets are usually filled with the color red, symbolizing luck and prosperity. But for Dat, the 25th of January was not a beginning. It was the scheduled end. On that afternoon, Dat's Facebook account posted a status update that would serve as his final public words to the world. It was brief, cryptic to the uninitiated, but horrifyingly clear to those who knew his secret. The update read simply, 3 hours left until the execution. Investigators believe that shortly after this message was sent, Dat traveled to the agreed-upon location. He carried with him the tools that would be used against him. He walked into the trap that he had helped to set. Based on the timestamp of the post and the activity logs on his other accounts, the community believes the tragedy occurred sometime around dusk, between 5:30 and 6 in the evening. As the sun set on the 25th of January, Dat's activity across all platforms ceased. In the physical world, he was gone. However, in the digital world, something unsettling began to happen. Dat's online presence did not die with him. A full month later, on the 25th of February, a private message was sent from Dat's account to one of his contacts. The message was cold and detached, stating simply that Dat had passed away. It was a notification, delivered with the casual tone of a status update. The investigators realized immediately that Dat could not have sent this. The person behind the keyboard was the executioner, the man known as Chung. This revelation added a new layer of psychological horror to the case. Chung had not only taken Dat's life, he had taken his digital skin. He was logging into the victim's accounts, reading his messages, and perhaps monitoring the reaction of his friends. It suggested a level of possessiveness and arrogance that terrified the OSINT community. The killer was walking around in the victim's digital shoes. The charade continued for months. On the 10th of June, 2025, Dat's Facebook account posted one final status update. It read, "From today, I am logging off this account for good." This was the final seal. The killer, likely realizing that the videos were about to surface or that questions were being asked, decided to sever the connection. But it was too late. The digital footprint had already been stamped into the servers. When the Vietnamese butcher videos went viral in July and traffic flooded Dat's page, the account was manually terminated. But for those following the breadcrumbs, the timeline told a clear story. The killer had lived alongside the memory of his victim for nearly half a year, operating his accounts while the real Dat lay silent. With the timeline established and the victim identified, the investigation shifted its gaze to the antagonist. The man in the video was an enigma, shielded by a mask and the anonymity of the internet. However, in the age of high-definition video, anonymity is an illusion. Every frame of footage contains data, and the OSINT community began to dissect the videos pixel by pixel, looking for the man hiding behind the mask. The investigators focused heavily on the clip titled "The Rehearsal." In this video, the killer stands over the victim, instructing him, because the camera angle was different and the lighting was harsh. Details that might have been hidden in the shadows were brought into the light. The killer, referred to as Chung, wore a distinct outfit. He was dressed in branded sportswear, specifically a set that appeared to be from the Adidas line. On his face, he wore a green plastic mask, which some users identified as a generic Guy Fawkes or hacker mask, while others speculated it might be a military-style covering. But clothes can be changed, and masks can be discarded. The investigators needed something permanent. They looked at his body. He had a stocky, solid build, suggesting a man of physical strength but not necessarily an athlete. Despite the mask covering his face, the camera angles caught the top of his head. He had a receding hairline, or perhaps he was balding. This detail alone helped narrow the profile. This was likely not a young teenager, but a middle-aged man. As they scrutinized the footage, they found the smoking gun, a mark that could not be removed, on the killer's upper arm. Visible when he moved to raise the cleaver, was a tattoo. It was a sequence of text, clear enough to be read. It spelled out a date, that day, 13/9, 13/9, the 13th of September. In the world of criminal investigation, a specific date tattooed on a suspect is as good as a fingerprint. It could be a birthday, an anniversary, or a memorial. Whatever it signified, it was a unique identifier that linked the masked monster to a specific point in time. The investigation then turned to the environment. The room where the tragedy took place was dubbed the Silent Witness. It was a small, tiled room that looked like a kitchen or a utility area. The floor was covered in blue and white patterned tiles. The walls were lined with red baseboards. Every object in that room was analyzed. On a table, a bottle of Lavi water was visible. Near the sink sat a yellow bottle of dishwashing liquid. Eagle-eyed observers noted that the brand of the dish soap was Chinese. While Chinese products are common in Vietnam, they are especially prevalent in the northern border provinces. The decor, the utensils, and the specific mix of Vietnamese and Chinese products pointed the compass north. The investigators began to theorize that the killer operated in a province like Lang Son, near the border crossing. The walls of the room were silent, but they were screaming clues. The misaligned cabinets, the plastic plants in the background of the office scene, the color of the fan blades, these were not random details. They were the unique fingerprint of a specific building. The OSINT community realized that if they could find a building that matched this interior, they would find the slaughterhouse. And inside that slaughterhouse, they would find the man with the 13th of September written on his skin. By late August of the year 2025, the digital trail was beginning to freeze over. The initial burst of energy that had fueled the OSINT community was fading into frustration. The victim, Nguyen Xuyen Dat, had been identified, and the timeline of his disappearance had been reconstructed with heartbreaking accuracy. Yet, the man in the green mask, the architect of the tragedy, remained a ghost. The clues were tantalizing, but insufficient. The blue and white tiles, the generic sportswear, and the distinctive tattoo were pieces of a puzzle that refused to lock together. The threads grew quieter, the updates became less frequent, and for months, a heavy silence settled over the investigation. It seemed as though the Vietnamese butcher was destined to join the ranks of countless other internet mysteries that would never be fully solved. Then, just as the hope of justice was beginning to flicker out, the story ignited once again. In the third week of November, a new figure emerged from the shadows, an anonymous Facebook user, who the community would come to refer to simply as the whistleblower, stepped forward with a story that changed everything. This individual was not just an observer, they were a survivor. They claimed to have been in direct contact with both the victim and the executioner during the critical days leading up to the incident. The whistleblower provided fresh evidence that sent shockwaves through the investigation groups. They released screenshots of their final correspondence with Dat, received on that fateful day, the 25th of January, 2025. The timestamps on these messages were crucial. At 2:40 in the afternoon, Dat had sent a message stating that the event would occur in approximately 3 hours. This piece of information definitively placed the time of the tragedy between 5:30 and 6 in the evening, confirming the community's theoretical timeline. But the content of the messages revealed something far more sinister than just a schedule. In his final texts, Dat mentioned that he had shared the whistleblower's contact details with the executioner. The implication was terrifyingly clear. The whistleblower had also considered offering themselves up to the darkness. They had stood on the precipice of the same decision that Dat had made, peering into the abyss. But at the last moment, they had pulled back. Instead of stepping into the executioner's path, they were now stepping forward to stop him. The whistleblower's motivation was simple. They wanted justice. Even though Dat had technically consented to his fate, the whistleblower recognized that the man known as Chung was a predator operating without fear. To prove it, they released their own chat history with the supposed killer, a man whose profile name on Facebook was Cam Van Chung. The logs were chilling. They painted a portrait of a man who was not haunted by what he had done, but empowered by it. In one exchange, when asked about the fate of the victim, Chung replied with a callousness that defied belief. He replied with inhumane callousness, implying that the victim had been completely disposed of. He spoke of the disposal of the victim as if it were a gardening chore. There was no remorse, only a cold, practical assessment of the aftermath. But Chung's arrogance would ultimately be his undoing. Emboldened by his anonymity and perhaps seeking a new participant for his dark rituals, he invited the whistleblower to discuss their own potential departure in person. He made a mistake that every criminal tries to avoid. He gave up his location. In a moment of supreme overconfidence, Chung sent a map pin to the whistleblower. He asked to meet at a specific address to discuss the logistics of the next event. The pin did not point to a vague area in the forest or a hidden shack in the mountains. It pointed to a busy street in Hu Lung Town, within the Lang Son province. The investigators zoomed in on the map. The pin was located just outside a government tax department building. For the first time in 10 months, the hunt for Chung had something solid. They were no longer looking for a needle in a haystack. They were looking at a specific street, in a specific town, in a specific province. The vague theories about the northern border were no longer theories, they were facts. The man with the tattoo, the man who treated human life like fertilizer, was walking the streets of Hu Lung. And thanks to the bravery of a survivor who refused to stay silent, the internet now knew exactly where to look. The net was no longer being cast wide. It was beginning to close. The investigation had now arrived at a specific coordinate on the map, a busy street in Hu Lung Town, in the province of Lang Son. But a location is only a place until you find the person who inhabits it. To bridge the gap between the geography and the suspect, the online community needed someone to take the final, dangerous step of connecting the dots. Enter a YouTube channel known as The Curious One. This creator had been quietly following the case for some time, using digital reconstruction tools to analyze the crime scenes. Armed now with the specific address provided by the whistleblower, the pin drop near the government tax department, The Curious One began to cross-reference the data with public social media profiles. He was looking for a ghost, but what he found was a pillar of the community. The investigator stated that he had identified the killer. However, before he could reveal the full extent of his findings, the investigation took a dark turn. The creator released a cryptic message, stating that the forces behind this mystery were too powerful and that they could swallow our entire team. He announced that his investigation would end there, likely due to threats, but in a final act of defiance, he shared a blurred image of a suspect's face and a screenshot of a username, Thansheng51s. The internet is a machine that does not forgive and does not forget. It took the OSINT community mere hours to unblur the name and trace the connections. The handle, Thansheng, appeared across multiple platforms, from TikTok to Instagram. These accounts were linked to a Twitter profile, which in turn linked back to a Facebook account belonging to a man named Doan Van Sang. When the investigators clicked on Doan Van Sang's profile, they did not find the digital footprint of an outcast or a drifter. They found the smiling face of success. Doan Van Sang was a man in his late 50s. He was a married father of 2, living a comfortable, affluent life in Langsun, right near the Chinese border. But it was his professional life that sent a chill through the community. Sang was not just a civilian, he was a former state official. He was the retired deputy head of a market management department team, specifically Team Number 4. His job had been to inspect suspect goods and enforce the law. He was a man sworn to protect the public order. Furthermore, he was the head of the Doan family clan in Langsun City, a position that commanded immense respect and authority over thousands of relatives. Photos on his profile showed him at banquets, receiving awards, and standing proudly in his uniform. He was connected to the government not only through his own career but through his wife and son as well. The contrast was nauseating. How could this respected bureaucrat be the butcher in the green mask? The community began to look closer, and the coincidences began to pile up until they were no longer coincidences. The investigators looked at Sang's family tree. His eldest son's name was Than Chung. This explained the online alias Chung that the killer had used to communicate with Dat and the whistleblower. The killer was hiding behind his own child's identity. Then came the smoking gun. They found a significant date related to a close family member that matched the evidence. The memory of the tattoo on the killer's arm flashed back into the minds of the sleuths. The text inked onto the executioner's skin read, "That day 13/9. The numbers matched perfectly. The killer had permanently marked his body with the date of his son's birth. It was a connection that was impossible to ignore. The scrutiny intensified. Users began to compare the clothes worn by Sang's son in public photos with the outfit worn by the killer in the rehearsal video. The sportswear was identical. However, the body type of the man in the video, stocky, balding, and older, did not match the son. It matched the father. The theory solidified. Sang was the perpetrator, wearing his son's clothes and using his son's name as a shield to enact his dark fantasies. As the OSINT community dug deeper into the digital history of the accounts linked to Sang, a disturbing psychological profile emerged. The man behind the mask had not just woken up one day and decided to become a monster. He had been cultivating this darkness for decades. Digital forensics revealed that the person operating these accounts had been active on the internet for nearly 20 years. He had started by seeking casual encounters on forums, but over time, his requests became more specific and more controlling. He adopted a master persona, seeking partners he could dominate and humiliate. The trail showed a slow, terrifying escalation. The man moved from fantasies of control to an obsession with extreme bodily harm, and, eventually, engaging in the most forbidden of acts. In the year 2022, the account linked to Sang had uploaded photos of severe forensic nature to a forum, claiming he wanted to toughen up the other members. The investigation had uncovered a double life of terrifying proportions. By day, Doan Van Sang was a man of the law, a leader of his clan, and a father who celebrated his son's birthday. By night, he was a predator who prowled the darkest corners of the web, looking for vulnerable souls like Nguyen Xuan Dat to pull into his orbit. The respected official and the masked butcher were one and the same. The monster was not hiding in a cave. He was hiding in an office, wearing a uniform. In the court of public opinion, suspicion is not enough. One needs proof. By this stage in the investigation, the online community had a name, Doan Van Sang, and a terrifying theory about his double life. But to turn that theory into a conviction, they needed to bridge the gap between the man in the official uniform and the masked figure in the dark footage. What followed was one of the most meticulous, crowdsourced forensic examinations in internet history. Thousands of anonymous users began to scour every pixel of available data, creating a digital dossier that would eventually become undeniable. The investigation began with the body of the suspect. While the killer had worn a mask to hide his face, he could not hide the map of his own skin. Netizens dug deep into the archives of the internet, locating an old, largely abandoned Facebook account that Sang had failed to scrub. On this profile, they found candid photographs of him in casual settings at the beach, at home, and wearing short-sleeved shirts. These images were placed side by side with high-definition screenshots from the incident videos. The comparison was chilling. The first match was a distinctive circular birthmark located on the suspect's shin. In the video, as the killer moved around the room, this mark was briefly visible. In the old vacation photos of Sang, the exact same mark appeared on the same leg, in the same position. The scrutiny moved upward. Investigators noticed a prominent birthmark pattern on the killer's right bicep and near the armpit area. When compared to photos of Sang wearing sleeveless shirts, the constellation of marks aligned perfectly. Even the scars told a story. A faint scar over one eyebrow, visible through the eye holes of the mask, matched a scar on Sang's face. The physical structure, the receding hairline, the shape of the ears, the set of the jaw was eerily similar. It was a biological barcode, and every line was scanning true. Then, the focus shifted to the wardrobe. The image of the killer's feet in the video revealed a pair of humble flip-flops. They were a common household item, easily overlooked. However, in a photo taken outside Sang's family home, a pair of flip-flops, identical in color, wear pattern, and design, was visible near the door. Even more damning was the sportswear. The killer had worn a specific set of branded athletic clothes in the rehearsal video. As previously noted, Sang's son had been pictured wearing this exact outfit. The theory that Sang had borrowed his son's clothing to obscure his age and identity became the leading narrative. It was a disguise of convenience, taken from the closet of his own home. But the most shocking revelation did not come from the man himself, but from the world he inhabited. The OSINT community turned its attention to the background of the videos. They were looking for the stage where this tragedy had played out. In the video titled The Rehearsal, the victim was seen kneeling in what appeared to be an office. In the background, viewers could see plastic plants, blue ceiling fan blades, and a row of cabinets that were slightly misaligned. It was a mundane, bureaucratic setting. Investigators found a TikTok video that Sang had filmed of himself while at work. He was standing in the office of the market management team number 3. As the camera panned around the room, the background came into focus. There were the plastic plants. There were the blue fan blades. There were the misaligned cabinets. The background of the horror video was identical to the background of Sang's government office. The investigation then moved to the second location, the tiled room where the final act occurred. This room featured green doors, red tile trim along the walls, blue floor tiles, and a white counter. It was a specific, somewhat dated interior design. The sleuths unearthed an old news article about the market management department where Sang worked. The article included a photograph taken at the department's old location, known as Team Number 4, where Sang had served as the second in command. In the photo, Sang is seen inspecting confiscated goods. Behind him, the background is unmistakable. The green doors, the red trim, the blue tiles. The realization hit the community with the force of a physical blow. The killer had not taken his victim to a secret dungeon or a remote cabin in the woods. He had taken him to his workplace. This was the architecture of guilt. The videos had been filmed inside the very government buildings where Sang was employed to uphold the law. The logic was twisted but practical. The incident took place during the Lunar New Year holiday, a time when government offices are deserted. Sang had likely volunteered for holiday duty, giving him the keys to the building and days of uninterrupted privacy. He had turned a place of public service into a private slaughterhouse, confident that his badge and his status would protect him from suspicion. But he had not counted on the eyes of the internet, which see everything, remember everything, and eventually connect every dot. When we imagine the lair of a monster, our minds often drift to the cinematic tropes of horror fiction. We picture a damp basement hidden beneath a floorboard, a soundproof dungeon in a remote cabin, or a secret bunker buried deep in the woods. We expect the location of a tragedy to look like a nightmare. But in the case of the Vietnamese butcher, the reality was far more disturbing because it was so incredibly mundane. The online community, in their grim fascination with the case, gave the location a nickname that stuck: the most depressing toilet in the world. The crime scene was not a dungeon. It was a bathroom and a small utility kitchen inside a government office. Specifically, it was the facility belonging to the Market Management Team No. 4 in Lang Son. Once the connection to Duan Van Sang was established, the location itself became a focal point of the investigation. The blue and white patterned floor tiles, the red ceramic trim, the green painted doors, and the white countertops. These were not the decor of a torture chamber. They were the standard, budget-friendly interior choices of a provincial administrative building. Thousands of people likely walked past that building every day. Dozens of employees likely used that very room to wash their hands or rinse their coffee cups, completely unaware that it would become the backdrop for one of the darkest videos ever uploaded to the internet. But why there? Why would a man with a comfortable home and a respected position choose to conduct such a heinous act at his workplace? The answer, investigators realized, lay in a chilling combination of arrogance and logistical brilliance. To understand the choice of venue, one must look at the calendar. The tragedy occurred on the 25th of January, in the year 2025, in Vietnam. This date is significant. It marks the beginning of the Lunar New Year, or Tet. Tet is the most important holiday in Vietnamese culture. It is a time when the entire country effectively shuts down. Major cities empty out as people return to their ancestral villages. Shops close, streets go quiet, and government offices lock their doors for a week-long celebration. For the average person, it is a time of joy and reunion. For Duan Van Sang, it was an opportunity. According to the investigation, Sang made a calculated move in the weeks leading up to the holiday. While his colleagues were likely requesting time off to be with their families, Sang reportedly volunteered to stay behind. He offered to be the one to watch over the office during the break. This gesture might have appeared selfless to his superiors, a dedicated senior officer willing to sacrifice his holiday for the good of the department. In reality, it was a tactical maneuver. By volunteering for the holiday shift, Sang guaranteed that he would be the only person in the building for days. He would have the keys. He would have the security codes. He would have total, uninterrupted privacy. The Market Management Office was not just a desk job. It was a facility equipped to handle seized goods. It had a kitchen for the staff. It had running water. It had cleaning supplies. It was a self-contained environment where Sang could control every variable. There is a grim logic to his decision. If he had committed the act in his own home, he would have risked discovery by his wife, his children, or his neighbors. A home is unpredictable, but an empty government office during the Tet holiday is a fortress of solitude. The image is haunting. Outside, the country was celebrating. Families were gathering. Fireworks were lighting up the sky, and incense was burning on altars. But inside the silent halls of the market management building, a very different ritual was taking place. Sang had turned a symbol of law and order into a slaughterhouse, confident that his badge would shield him from suspicion. He believed that the walls of authority were thick enough to muffle the truth. He was wrong. The walls could not speak, but they could be recognized. And in the end, the very room he chose to hide his secret became the evidence that destroyed him. In the traditional narrative of a manhunt, the suspect runs and the detective chases. It is a linear pursuit across physical space. But in the digital age, the dynamic is far more claustrophobic. The hunter and the hunted often occupy the same virtual room, breathing the same digital air, watching each other through the distorted glass of computer screens. As the OSINT community tightened the net around Doan Van Sang, they began to realize something unsettling. He was not fleeing. He was right there in the room with them. It was discovered that Sang had quietly infiltrated the very Facebook groups that were dedicated to unmasking him. He was not just a passive observer. He was an active participant in his own investigation. For weeks, he sat behind his screen, reading the theories, analyzing the evidence being compiled against him, and watching the timeline of his own crime being reconstructed by strangers. At first, his presence was subtle. He was just another profile in a sea of thousands, perhaps lurking to gauge how close the sleuths were getting to the truth. But as the evidence mounted, the birthmarks, the tattoo, the office location, Sang's behavior began to shift. The silence of the observer gave way to the arrogance of the untouchable. He began to interact with the posts. When users expressed frustration at the lack of police action or hit a dead end in their research, Sang would react with laughing emojis. It was a digital taunt, a subtle way of mocking the efforts of those trying to bring him to justice. It was the behavior of a man who believed he was smarter than the collective intelligence of the internet, a man who felt safe behind the shield of his status and his screen. But as the pressure mounted and his name began to circulate more openly, the mask of the cool, detached observer slipped. The taunts turned into outbursts. In a series of bizarre and agitated status updates and comments, Sang began to address the mob directly. "I am the executioner," he wrote in one startling post. "Who can catch me?" He went further, attempting to flip the moral narrative. "Let me tell you straight, you are the real executioners, because you want more people to die so you can celebrate. Is that not right?" It was a fascinating and disturbing glimpse into the suspect's mind. He was projecting his own guilt onto the people trying to solve the case. He portrayed himself as a victim of a witch hunt, a man besieged by a bloodthirsty crowd. In another post, he struck a tone of nihilistic defiance, writing, "I have lived 60 years in this world. I am no longer afraid of death." He even issued challenges, inviting those who doubted him or wanted to confront him to come to his house. "Who exposed me? Show yourself," he demanded. To the psychologists and criminologists watching the case unfold, this did not look like the calculated confidence of a mastermind. It looked like the extinction burst of a trapped animal. It was the flailing of a man who realized the walls were closing in, oscillating between grandiosity and panic. He was losing control of the narrative, and his only recourse was to shout into the void. The surreal nature of the situation was compounded by the involvement of his family. Sang's son, whose identity had been used as a shield by his father, jumped into the fray. Whether out of blind loyalty, denial, or a shared sense of twisted humor, the son posted a photograph of his lunch with a caption that sent waves of revulsion through the community. "Come on," he wrote, "it is just biological matter." The post was likely intended as dark satire, a way to mock the serious allegations being leveled against his father. But to the thousands of people who had seen the horrific reality of the video clips, it was not a joke. It was a confession of indifference. It showed a profound lack of empathy and a disturbing disconnect from the gravity of the situation. The investigators watched this digital meltdown in real time. They archived every screenshot, every comment, and every reaction. Sang thought he was fighting back, but in reality, he was providing the final pieces of the puzzle. His outbursts confirmed that the pressure was working. The ghost was no longer invisible. He was screaming to be seen, and soon, the authorities would have no choice but to listen. In the digital age, information travels at the speed of light. But justice often moves at the speed of bureaucracy. By late October of the year 2025, a suffocating tension had settled over the case. The online community had done the impossible. They had identified the victim, reconstructed the timeline, located the crime scene, and unmasked the likely perpetrator. The evidence against Doan Van Sang was not just circumstantial, it was overwhelming. Yet, in the physical world, Sang remained a free man. He was still living in his home, still posting on social media, and still walking the streets of Lang Son as if nothing had happened. This delay birthed a new kind of fear. The internet began to whisper the word that plagues so many investigations involving powerful figures: corruption. Doan Van Sang was not an ordinary citizen. He was a former deputy head of the Market Management Department, a man with deep ties to the local administration and a leader of a prominent family clan. In the eyes of the frustrated public, his freedom was not a result of a lack of evidence, but a result of his connections. Theories began to circulate that he was using his influence to suppress the investigation, or worse, that the local authorities were actively protecting one of their own to avoid a scandal. The atmosphere grew paranoid. The members of the Asint community, who had been so vocal in their pursuit of the truth, suddenly felt the chill of the spotlight turning back on them. If Sang was powerful enough to stall a murder investigation, what could he do to a group of amateur sleuths? Fearing retaliation, many of the key investigators began to scrub their digital footprints. They locked their accounts, changed their usernames, and went dark. The investigation that had been a loud, chaotic roar was reduced to a nervous whisper. But silence is not defeat. In the shadows, the core members of the group decided to launch one final, undeniable strike. They realized that scattered Facebook posts and forum threads were too easy to ignore. They needed something permanent. They needed a weapon that could not be deleted. They began to compile everything they had found into a single, comprehensive document. They gathered the screenshots of the messages, the side-by-side comparisons of the birthmarks, the analysis of the office decor, and the timeline of the digital impersonation. They organized the chaos into a structured, professional report. The result was a 106-page dossier. It was a masterpiece of crowdsourced investigation. To ensure the story could not be contained within the borders of Vietnam, they translated the entire document into English. They wanted the world to see. When they released the PDF, it did not just circulate, it exploded. It was shared across every major social platform, downloaded thousands of times, and sent to journalists and influencers. It went viral in the truest sense of the word. The sheer weight of the evidence presented in those 106 pages made it impossible for the authorities to look the other way. The internet had built a case so airtight that silence was no longer an option. The long wait was finally over. On the morning of November 28th, the inevitable finally arrived. The silence of the authorities was broken not by a press release, but by the sound of sirens. Police units descended upon the home of Doan Van Sang and the office building of the market management team. The digital manhunt had transitioned into a physical arrest. The official announcement was understated, but the details that emerged from the police report were forensic confirmation of everything the internet had suspected. The investigators moved into the silent witness, the tiled room in the government building, and began the grim task of searching for what had been left behind. Even though months had passed and the room had likely been cleaned countless times, science has a way of uncovering the truth. The police report stated that forensic teams dismantled the plumbing and searched the drainage systems. Their diligence yielded results that were clinical yet horrifying. At the sink area, investigators found significant biological traces left behind by the victim. Moving deeper into the infrastructure of the building, They examined the septic tank connected to the restroom. There, in the darkness, they found numerous bone fragments. Similar biological traces were located in the drainage cavity of the kitchen and the water channel behind the building. The killer had tried to wash away his crime, but the building itself had held on to the evidence. Simultaneously, a search was conducted at Sang's private residence. The police were looking for the trophies of the crime, and they found them. In his wardrobe, they seized 2 jackets that were a perfect match for the sportswear worn by the masked figure in the rehearsal video. They also found a space heater that matched the appliance visible in the background of the execution clip. But perhaps the most damaging piece of physical evidence was found in the possession of Sang's family. Investigators seized a mobile phone that was being used by Sang's elder sister. When they analyzed the device, they realized it was not hers. It belonged to the victim, Nguyen Xuan Dat. When questioned, the sister provided a statement that tightened the noose around her brother's neck. She claimed that Sang had given her the phone to use. He had taken the device of the man he had destroyed and gifted it to his own sibling as if it were a casual hand-me-down. This object linked the victim directly to the suspect's inner circle. The digital evidence, the forensic traces, and the physical possessions had all converged. Duan Van Sang was in handcuffs, and the mystery of the Vietnamese butcher was solved. Following his arrest, Duan Van Sang did not remain silent. Sitting in the sterile confines of an interrogation room, stripped of his uniform and his online avatars, he began to speak. However, those expecting a tearful apology or a moment of genuine remorse were met with something far more calculating. Sang admitted to the act, yes. But he immediately set to work constructing a narrative that painted himself not as a predator, but as a reluctant service provider. According to the official confession, Sang stated that he first became acquainted with Nguyen Xuan Dat around the year 2020. He claimed that their relationship began innocently enough on social media, but took a dark turn when Dat confided in him about his membership in a deviant online group hosted on the Motherless platform. Sang told investigators that he was initially repulsed by Dat's interests. He framed himself as a curious observer who was slowly dragged into the abyss by the victim's persistence. He claimed that Dat repeatedly invited him to join these groups, and that, over time, his resistance eroded. He began to research the disturbing and violent topics Dat spoke of, and the darker side of human desire, until he, too, became a participant. The narrative Sang spun was one of transactional consent. He told police that Dat had offered him a sum of 10 million dong, roughly $380 to rent a location where his final fantasy could be carried out. Sang claimed that by July of the year 2024, he finally agreed to the proposal. He described the events of January 25th with a chilling clinical detachment. He stated that he summoned Dat to the market management building at dusk. He claimed that Dat brought the tools 2 heavy cleavers himself. Sang admitted to ending Dat's life exactly as depicted in the footage that had horrified the world. But the most disturbing part of the confession concerned the aftermath. When asked why he had treated the victim's remains in such a specific manner, Sang offered a pragmatic, almost industrial excuse. He admitted to using extreme methods to attempt to destroy the remains and conceal the crime. However, he denied that this was for the purpose of consumption. Instead, he claimed it was simply a method to prevent rapid decomposition and odor. He argued that he was merely trying to sterilize the evidence to avoid detection in a shared office building. He detailed how he smashed the remaining bone structures and placed the debris into approximately 10 plastic bags. He confessed to disposing of the evidence in various ways to ensure it was completely gone, while the rest was disposed of in public trash bins across the city. As for the weapons, he stated that 2 days later, on the 27th of January, he threw the cleavers into a handcart parked along the roadside while traveling home. The public and the OSINT community viewed this confession with deep skepticism. It felt like a strategic defense. Sang was trying to portray himself as a man who was manipulated, perhaps even hypnotized by the victim's desires. But the evidence told a different story. This was a man with a decades-long history of posting about cannibalism and torture on forums. This was a man who had actively tried to recruit the whistleblower as a second victim. This was a man who had boasted to his online friends that Dat had become fertilizer. The confession was not the truth. It was just one last attempt to control the story. With Doan Van Sang behind bars and the forensic evidence secured, the case of the Vietnamese butcher seemed to have reached its conclusion. But as the dust settled, a darker, more unsettling question began to rise from the depths of the investigation. Was Sang truly acting alone, or was he a small cog in a much larger, invisible machine? The investigation revealed that, long before the videos appeared on the shock site where I first found them, they were circulating in a different corner of the internet. The footage had been distributed by unknown Chinese-speaking individuals through encrypted messaging apps like Telegram. These were not free exchanges. The videos were products. Access to the full pack of 11 recordings and 98 photographs cost hundreds of dollars. This commercial aspect challenges Sang's narrative that this was purely a personal fantasy. If it was just about fulfilling a promise to Dat, why was the footage filmed with multiple camera angles? Why was the lighting set up so professionally? And most damning of all, why was it being sold? This has led to a terrifying theory that Sang may have been part of a broader illicit video trade operating throughout East and Southeast Asia. Internet sleuths uncovered discussions on platforms like Baidu Tieba, where anonymous distributors advertised similar content. They used coded language to bypass censors. They spoke of regular groups and large groups with tens of thousands of users. They used dark slang terms to refer to deviant behaviors and severe violations of the deceased, and forensic to describe unblemished bodies. The implication is that the Vietnamese butcher videos were not an anomaly. They may have been a commissioned content produced to feed a hungry market of buyers who pay top dollar to see reality break. It raises the possibility that Sang was not just a killer, but a content creator for a network that spans borders and languages. Whether Sang keeps the profits, or if he was merely a supplier for a larger syndicate, remains the final, unsolved mystery. But the impact of this case on Vietnam is undeniable. It has shattered the illusion of safety for millions. It has shown that the monster is not always a stranger in a dark alley. Sometimes, he is the respected official working in the government building next door. As Doan Van Sang awaits trial, likely facing the highest penalty the law can provide, the legacy of Nguyen Xuan Dat remains complicated. He was a man lost to mental illness, a prisoner of his own fate who sought a tragic end. But no level of consent can justify the actions of the man who held the cleaver. This story serves as a grim warning about the digital abyss. It reminds us that behind the pixels on our screens, real lives are being destroyed. I implore you, as you navigate the internet, to remember that some doors should never be opened and some footage should never be watched. The investigation is over, but the shadows it revealed will linger for a very long time. I would like to dedicate this coverage to the thousands of anonymous investigators in the OSINT and cyber investigation Vietnam community. Without their tireless work, their translation of documents, and their refusal to let a lonely man be forgotten, the truth would still be buried in a septic tank in Lang Son. They proved that even in the darkest corners of the web, there is a light that can expose the monsters.